Welcome everybody to Sunday morning at the virtual Marxist Library. My name is Eugene Rule, and I am one of the group of volunteers that puts this program on every week. My job has been to do the mailings and make the coffee, but you're going to have virtual coffee. So while you're getting your coffee and getting settled, let me just mention a few things about the library and the community we've built here in Oakland around the library. Because the library was formed from the collections of two remarkable individuals, Carl Niebel, who was a refugee from national Nazism, and Roscoe Proctor, who was born in Texas, an activist, labor activist, worked with the ILWU, was a farm worker and active, and also a high-ranking member of the Communist Party USA. And so the spirit of these two individuals lives on in the community we built here. It's always been a non-sectarian place that's open to individuals of different political persuasions, predominantly on the left, socialist left, but non-sectarian and multi-tendencies. And about 20 years ago, the Institute for the Critical Study of Society was formed by the library in order to further the library's goals, which are to keep the work of Karl Marx alive and to support struggles for gender and social and racial equality, and to work for socialism. And that's what we try to do here. We're not all of one mind. We belong to different groups, different tendencies. So the programs don't reflect any kind of group consensus on the issues concerned. But we are all united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been in the past. And as a group, we continue to be inspired by the work of Karl Marx, including his 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I think those words were never more true than they are today. And we're very happy and pleased. In particular, I've heard so much about and seen so much of David Bacon's work that I'm really happy to meet him, if not in person, in Zoom. So to introduce David and moderate the program, I'll turn it over to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, David. David Bacon is a photographer, a writer, and a lifelong worker for the interests of the working class. And that's about all I'm going to say about him.
Thank God.
And his program, I'm sure some of you have seen his work, and there'll be a chance to learn more about where you can see it. He has a newsletter that he sends out. I'm sure he'll be happy to include anyone here who doesn't already get it. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to David.
Great. Well, I am going to start screen sharing here. So give me a moment. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the program this morning. I've been to innumerable meetings at the library, and I'm one time a member of the library's board. So this is sort of like talking in the living room. So thanks for inviting me to do that. I'm gonna show photographs while I'm talking. You asked me to talk about farm workers and immigration this morning, and I'm going to, after a sort of an introduction that talks a little bit about the way that I work, I'm going to sort of present you with the voices, basically, of workers talking about who they are and what conditions they work in and kind of how they see the world. And I'm also going to show you photographs while I'm talking so that we can see the human face of the people that we are talking about. So, okay. Now, what is happening here? How come? Oh, okay, do it that way. I was a union organizer for about 25 years, including many years for the United Farm Workers. In fact, I grew up in Oakland. I was born in New York City, and my dad was a local president for United Office and Professional Workers of America. My mom was an editor for international publishers. So in depth of the 50s, they decided to leave New York, and my dad came out to California looking for a job and found one in a printing plant at the University of California. And that's why I grew up in Oakland and not in Brooklyn. But, you know, growing up in Oakland, it's not that Oakland did not have a Latino community, but it was far away from where I lived. And so the big questions about race when I was growing up were about Black people and white people. And so I really didn't know much about Mexicans or Latino culture or rural people until I went to work for the Farm Workers Union. And the Farm Workers Union and the workers in it, really, they were like a school for me. They taught me an awful lot. They taught me Spanish. They taught me about the lives of rural people. They taught me about immigration. I saw the first immigration raid when I was working for the union. They taught me about Mexican culture and Chicano culture, and basically it changed my life, really. And so after that, I worked for other unions. I was a factory worker in Silicon Valley and got blacklisted there, and then went to work for unions partly out of economic necessity and partly out of commitment. So working for unions and organizing strikes like this one with the UE in Pomona made me an immigrant rights activist, because I saw so many workers from other countries who were trying to organize. And so I wanted to understand why people have come here and how and why they fight, and how immigration laws and policies are used against them. So for the last 25 plus years, I've been a photojournalist and a writer, really doing the same work from my point of view, organizing, helping our movement to grow. So these are not neutral photographs, and I'm not a neutral person. I don't claim to be an unbiased observer. And so if the work that I do helps to strengthen movements for justice, well, as far as I'm concerned, it will serve a good purpose. So I want to talk to you about the people working in the fields here on the Pacific Coast, many of whom today are coming from southern Mexico, from places like Oaxaca. I want to look at what happens to people when they get here, especially as farm workers. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the way that I work and the reason that I do it. Several years ago, I was invited to a conference in Tijuana called El Gran Mexico to show images of Mexican workers in the US. And the conference in that exhibit was called, as you could sort of see in the photograph here, in Los Campos del Norte, Norte being north of the border. So the idea of this conference and really of the show was that with about 11% of the Mexican people living here in the US, Mexico really exists here. If we think about it as Mexico in terms of Mexico as being its people, and people need to know what happens to Mexicans here, both people in Mexico and people here as well. So we called this photograph In the Fields of the North, because if you're in Mexico, we're in the North. We used the wall here, as you can see, to show these photographs in the creative way that other Mexican and border artists have done this. That is, that if we can't get rid of it, let's at least make it serve the needs of the people. Now, many of the photographs that we put on the wall in Tijuana are part of an exhibition that is actually still up on the walls because, you know, with museums not able to admit visitors, what they've done is they've turned it into virtual exhibits. And you can see them. There's one at the Museum of the History of Tijuana, and there's another one in the Los Altos History Museum in Silicon Valley. And they've both done video walkarounds of the show. So you can, I can give you, if you let me know how to get a hold of you or send me your email address, I can send you the links for those shows. So what these photographs do is they show the reality of exploitation. That is, they show how hard people work in their communities in poverty, but they also show the culture of indigenous communities and how people organize for change. And how we organize for change is part of our culture. It's the culture of resistance and how we change social reality. So I want to talk about these photographs and what their purpose is. Alexander Rodchenko, who was a photographer in Moscow in the 1920s, he said, "We must take photographs from every angle but the navel." He and his fellow photographers pioneered the use of extreme angles and close-ups as a way to shake the viewer's perspective and liberate us from complacency. This photograph, for instance, that we're looking at here, uses Rodchenko's idea of using a low angle to make the worker look big and important, and also at the same time to show how she's doing the work. Bertolt Brecht said that drama and art in general should stimulate people to question social reality in a critical way, not just tell stories or romanticize things. He thought that most art puts people to sleep, and he wanted to wake people up. Nacho Lopez, who was a famous Mexican photojournalist, said that photography was not meant as art to adorn walls, but rather to make obvious the ancestral cruelty of man against man. What all these artists have in common is that they view themselves as participants in the world and its social movements, and I do too. I use a method that combines photographs with interviews and personal histories, and I call this combination the reality check, the documentation of social reality. It is documentation with a purpose, though, not just as an outside observer. Documenting social reality actually is part of the movement for social change. So when I began to work as a photographer and a writer, documenting the lives of migrants and farm workers, I took with me the perspective of my previous work as a union organizer. Carrying a camera for me is a way to organize for social and racial justice, which are the same goals that I had as an organizer. For me, photography is a cooperative project. When I went to take this photograph here of a strike in the labor camp at Sakuma Farms in Washington State, it was in cooperation with the workers there who had organized a new union, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, and in a few minutes I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened there. So today, I'm talking with you as an artist, a writer, and a photographer, but also as an organizer. The thread that runs through this work is the idea that we are trying to change the way people think. Because social change comes about when people change the way they understand the world and then they act on it. And sometimes this happens in a house meeting, and sometimes on a picket line, and sometimes our understanding grows because we read a book or we see a photograph that makes us think. And all of these things are part of organizing. Today, the farm worker communities in Washington State are in upheaval. On the coast, a 4-year struggle has won an agreement for the country's newest farm worker union, which is called Familias Unidas por la Justicia, which means Families United for Justice. In central Washington, workers who have been living in agricultural valleys for decades are in danger of displacement by the mushrooming recruitment of guest workers who themselves face difficult work and living conditions. In fact, the concentration of the coronavirus is the strongest on the Pacific coast in those valleys in central Washington, especially in the barracks for these guest workers. So in photographs and narratives, I try to paint a picture of this life in the fields today. This is the story of the food we eat. More berries and apples come from Washington's fields than from any other state, and yet most of us are pretty ignorant about the lives of the people who bring this fruit to our table. These photographs are intended to help give us an appreciation of the thirst for social justice among the people whose sacrifice it takes. They show the modern history of farm labor organizing, of people challenging the barriers of discrimination against indigenous and sexual identities, and of lives of hard work and poverty. So today, I want us to hear the voices of people who work in the fields leading those struggles for justice. But before we get into the stories of Familias Unidas por la Justicia and the strike at Sakuma Farms, I want to talk about some simple questions, and just talk about what the reality of the conditions are for workers. One of the reasons, for instance, we read today that that Governor Newsom has declared the 7 counties of the San Joaquin Valley a COVID emergency area because the COVID rate in Fresno County, Tulare County, Kern County, San Joaquin County is much higher per capita than it is in urban counties like Alameda County here. And the reasons for that, I think, are worth thinking about and talking about, and we can talk about that a little bit when it comes to questions and answers too. But I think in this photograph, we see something that's pretty a clear reason why, and that is that this family of Purepecha workers in Oxnard, because of their low income, live and sleep in a single room. And so you can see the bunk beds here, and you think about what life is like for these folks here. So obviously one question is that the danger, because it's impossible to socially distance here. And if one of the family members gets sick and gets the virus, how are they supposed to self-isolate if in fact they can hardly pay the rent for the room that they're living in? But I think that when we look at the photographs, just the human part of us can respond and ask, and I think a lot of other questions, occur to us. These young teenage women here are at an age, I have daughters, I have 3 daughters, and I know that, when adolescence hits, personal privacy is extremely important to people. And yet, how do you get privacy in a living situation like this? It's really, I think it magnifies a lot of the difficulties that people have, growing up in general. So here's another photograph here. This is Lorena Hernandez picking blueberries in Fresno. And, obviously this is a picture of a farm worker, right? I mean, how can we tell? Because she's working. We can see her picking the blueberries, right? What about this though? Are these farm workers? These are pictures of people doing the dances of their hometowns in Oaxaca, in Fresno, in a festival called the Guelaguetza. And we have so many people from Oaxaca living in California now that we have at least 7 Guelaguetza festivals every year, or at least we did until the virus hits. And here are Triqui women dancing at a cultural event in the public library in Hollister, where Triqui people are actually a majority of the people who live there. So again, are these farm workers? Yes, they are. That's what people do for a living. But I think that these photographs also tell us something else important, and that is that people are more than just the work that they do. Especially people who carry their culture with them from 1,000 miles away and then reproduce it here in whatever circumstances they can here in the US. But I think there are a lot of other ideas that we have about who farm workers are. These 2 young guys eating lunch in the rows of the raspberry plants here, are they farm workers? Well, if they're working, obviously they are farm workers, but in a way they kind of defy our modern kind of accepted wisdom or stereotype about who farm workers are, because they're white, right? And our whole idea of who farm workers are is that farm workers are people of color. The question is, since we know that most farm workers are people of color, are people farm workers because of their color or because of the work they do? Is farm work an identity or is it a job? And this is an important question because farm workers, both in California and Washington and most places in this country, have almost always been people of color. We have this mythology about farm workers in this country that in some ways has some roots that are kind of progressive. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, the novels that he wrote were about the strikes and the struggles of farm workers in the 1930s, in a very brief period of time of maybe half a dozen years, in which white people constituted a really big percentage of the farm labor force in California. But aside from that period of time, there really never were a really statistically large number of farm workers here. And in fact, farm workers always came from somewhere else. People have not only been people of color, they've also been migrants from other countries. So here we have Estela Ramirez, a Zapotec woman from Oaxaca, which is where the Zapotec towns and communities are. Hieronima Alvarez, a Triqui woman, a Mixteca woman from Oaxaca, also picking berries. So these are farm workers in a field. Where did they come from? Obviously, as we can see from the captions here, these workers in particular are coming from Oaxaca. On the coast, where most blueberries and raspberries come from, the two languages you're most likely to hear when you listen to berry workers talking with each other in the fields are Mixteco and Triqui, which are the most largest language groups in Oaxaca. So Oaxaca, tens of thousands of people have left Oaxaca to come to work here. So one obvious question is, and in fact, this is one of the questions that got me started as a journalist when I kind of led me out of working directly for unions into what I do now, is why? What's happening to people where they come from? And so here we see Zacarias Salazar in Oaxaca plowing a cornfield behind oxen. Now, this is an interesting photograph because I'm not trying to say in this photograph that all the farmers in Oaxaca are using plows behind oxen. That's not true. Farming in Mexico uses tractors and is mechanized as well too. Although still for many poor and subsistence farm workers, these traditional farming methods are still the ones that people use. The main thing of trying to see in this picture here is that it's very difficult bringing in a crop of corn. And one of the impacts of the North American Free Trade Agreement was to allow the dumping of corn by US corporations on the market in Mexico, which shoved the price of corn so low that it really became only a subsistence crop. In other words, not something that farmers could sell at a price that would actually pay them the cost of growing it, which in turn was one of the reasons why so many corn farmers came out of Oaxaca and southern Mexico to the US as migrants. And we now have all these dance festivals in California. We should be grateful in a way, I suppose, but such a painful process. 3 million people lost their livings. Here we see the mother of a friend of mine, Santoria Maldonado, cooking tortillas on a wood fire. All I'm trying to say with these photographs is that, that life can be pretty hard for people in Oaxaca. And I think that understanding how hard it is also helps us to understand why this man or woman, or more likely their kids, might want to come here. But was this always where farm workers came from, Oaxaca? Well, obviously not. 80 years ago, many, if not most, farm workers on the Pacific coast came from the Philippines. They came from Garcia Hernandez, for instance, this town where rice farmers live in the Visayas, or from banana plantations in Mindanao. In fact, the first unions for farm workers in Washington state were started by Filipinos, first in the CIO, and then later in Local 37, well, it began as Local 7 of Yucapao, which was the CIO union for farm workers. And then after 49, after the Red Purge, when Yucapao was destroyed, that union became Local 37 of the ILWU. It's no accident that at the same time that farm workers from the Philippines were organizing their first unions in Washington and in California in the 30s, back in the Philippines, workers were also organizing their first unions. In fact, they certainly knew what was going on with each other and offered each other support at various times. Some of the organizers of that time, like Larry Itliong here, organized farm workers both in Washington and in California. He and the Filipinos belonged to the ILWU when they worked in Alaska in the salmon canneries in the summer. And then in the 50s, they organized another union. And then when they came back to California and to Washington state, they worked as farm workers. So in the 50s, they organized another union called AWOC, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And they were the workers and the union that started the Great Strike in 1965, first in Coachella and then in Delano. So the history of unions among farm workers is a long one in Washington state and California both, and that history is connected. When people in Washington state heard about the Great Strike in Delano and the formation of the United Farm Workers, they began to organize as well too. The first place they did that was at a huge winery, which was called Chateau Saint-Michel, and you can buy their wine on the shelves at Safeway. This struggle went on for many years. Finally, in the mid-1980s, organizers came from the Rainbow Coalition and Jobs with Justice, and with the workers, they launched a boycott of Chateau Saint-Michel that won a contract. And the main organizer of that effort was a young woman from a farm worker family in Bellingham, Washington, Rosalinda Guillen. To Rosalinda, winning that contract was important, but it wasn't justice all by itself. So here's what she said about it. She said, "I don't think I can win a union contract at Chateau Saint-Michel, and then I'm done. This is just barely touching the surface. If you're an organizer, you know that the longer you do it, the more you're digging into the fundamental causes of the oppression your people are under. Because you know what? These workers are still in the fight. They're fighting every day for their existence. And maybe it's easier because of that contract, but our goal should be fundamental change." After that contract was signed, and this is Rosalinda here talking with workers at a strike that came a little bit later at Sakuma Farms. After that contract was signed with the winery, Rosalinda was brought by the UFW to California. She was an organizer in the big campaign to organize strawberry workers in Watsonville at the end of the 90s, and then became the UFW's political organizer responsible for legislation in Sacramento. She took one of the ideas that they pioneered at Chateau Saint-Michel of a kind of forced arbitration of union contracts where workers have voted for the union and got the legislature here in California to put it into the law. That makes California's law, which we had a first law from 1975, the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. But with this addition of forced arbitration, that gives us here in California the best labor law for farm workers anywhere in this country. I would say it's the best labor law for workers, period, because we don't have forced arbitration for first contracts for any other workers except farm workers. So for once, farm workers actually have it a little bit better legally than other workers do. Afterwards, Rosalinda decided to go back home to Washington. She left the UFW, and in Bellingham, she started another organization called Community to Community. That became so active and well known that whenever farm workers in Washington decided to fight against abuse or get better wages or conditions, that was the first organization that they would call, and that's what happened in 2013. But before I get there, I want to give you some idea of what the work is like. And I'm going to give you the words of a young woman I talked with in Wapato, Washington 3 years ago, because she tells us really what it is or how it feels to be a farm worker and what it is that gets people to organize. So this is Eva Chavez here, and I spoke with her and she described her work life. So she says, "Sometimes I'd barely make it home because I was so tired." She was picking apples. "Coming back from work was dangerous if the ranch was too far from home. You're so tired, and sometimes you sleep on the road, or you could have an accident. 2 or 3 times I'd just park outside my house and sleep in the car. I didn't even have the energy to go inside. When I got good at the work, I could make good money, but I would have to kill myself to do it. I would have to try to focus on the wages and not on the pain. It was hard to get motivated to wake up every morning. You're so tired from the day before, but it doesn't matter. You have to wake up." Women who are married and have kids wake up way earlier than their husbands. They prepare the food, they work, sometimes the same as the husband, and then they come home and cook for the husband and the kids. They fix the house, they do the laundry, they help the kids. It's very tough. I think about how much damage farm workers are doing to their bodies. Some take a lot of pills, or they drink 1 or 2 Red Bulls or Monsters a day. These things damage your body, but they are too exhausted. You got to be very careful with the money you make, because it's not enough. And then when farm workers do speak up, the owners of the ranches say they don't have any money. We have to work holidays and we don't get paid extra. If we get sick, they're not going to give you sick days. If you're pregnant, they're not going to give you maternity leave. We put our lives out there in the fields for a job, and we will never get that time back. Now, I did this interview before the coronavirus, but think about it also about the fact that the benefits supposedly that workers in this country got as a result of the CARES Act and the legislation in Washington, half of farm workers don't get them because they don't have papers, and you have to have immigration status to qualify for anything that's related to those benefits, the relief, or the ones that are distributed through the unemployment office. So here's Eva talking again. She says, there was a big issue with Evans Fruit Company where they had a mayordomo, a foreman who raped women. So on top of working hard, on top of not earning enough, on top of not getting benefits, women still have to handle those situations which are not right. Women wear loose clothes and they cover their faces. They don't want to show anything so that they won't be seen as objects. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that. Why do we have to do that? Women are not sexual objects. I could never say I was gay in the fields. There are some men who are just so screwed up that they think, oh, she's gay because she hasn't found a good man like me. No, that's who I am. They cannot respect that. It's not that I don't want to talk about my sexuality, but sometimes people are just so close-minded that they cannot understand. And sometimes there are people who have this devil thinking that, oh, you're gay and I'm going to make you a woman. So in 2013, workers protesting these kinds of conditions, these low wages at a berry ranch near Burlington called Sakuma Farms, started protesting. They met with the managers and they asked for a wage raise. And the leader of that effort was fired. And because those workers were living in the labor camp, which we see here in this photograph behind these workers here, getting fired also meant getting kicked out of the labor camp. So for Federico, the guy who was fired, who come all the way from California every year, which about half of those workers came up for the season to pick in Washington and then went back to California every year, losing a place to live and a job, pardon me, and a job at the same time put him in a desperate situation. So the rest of the workers stopped work to get his job back. Rosario Ventura was one of those workers who would come up from California, and I interviewed her and she told me what this was like. She said, I've always lived in the labor camp during picking season. And here it is, she's also showing her, she's a tricky woman, and so she put on this sort of, well, she's making a huipil, one of these very beautiful garments, woven garments that women wear. And she had sort of had it half made. She had done the weaving, but she hadn't sewn them together. But she sort of put them on in order to sort of take this family photo here, which says something about her feeling for her own culture and also people's efforts to reproduce their culture here as migrants in the US. So anyway, she says, we decided to continue living in California and we never moved to Washington permanently. In the summer, we go to Washington, and then when the work runs out, we come back to Madera here in California. We go every season. When we go to Washington, we have to rent someplace in Madera to store our belongings, like our clothes. Then when we return, we have to search for a new home again. When we're in Washington, we have to save for the winter season because there's no work until April. The trip to Washington is expensive, about $250 in gas and food. If we don't have enough money, we have to ask for a loan. And that's what we normally do, since by then we've used up what we saved from the previous year. The strike started when the company fired Federico. We wanted Sakuma to raise the piece rates, and the company refused. They told us if we want to work, work, and if not, get out. Then they accused Federico of starting a protest. They went to his cabin to kick him out of the camp, and that's when we stopped work to get his job back. We were also upset about the conditions in the labor camp. The mattress, like the one we see in Filemon's cabin next door here, the mattress they gave us was torn and dirty and the wire was coming out and poked us. We're accustomed to sleeping with the kids, but the bed was so small we couldn't even fit on it. There were cockroaches and rats. The roof leaked when it rained. They just put bags in the holes and it still leaked. All my children's clothes were wet. The county inspector would come and he would check the cabin, but the company man in charge of the camp told me, if the inspector comes, don't say anything or you will have a lot of problems. They always try to make us afraid to speak up. If you ask for another 5 cents, they fire you. They threatened to remove us from the camp because of the strikes and said they'd fire us. They are always threatening us. They fired Ramon also, who was the leader of the strike in the union, because he talked back to them. But thank God he had the courage to talk. So those workers organized themselves. But one of the biggest problems they had was that Sakuma Farms had brought in 78 workers on H-2A visas. Now that wasn't enough to do all the work because the company hires about 500 people every year. But the strikers thought, if it's 78 this year, how do we know they won't replace all of us next year? And that's exactly what the company tried to do. In this program, the H-2A program, Growers recruit workers in Mexico and they bring them to the US with temporary visas called H-2A. Workers can't bring their families and they can only stay as long as the work lasts. When it's over, they have to go back to Mexico. And if they don't work fast enough or they try to organize a union, they get fired. And if they get fired, they lose the visa, so they're deported, and then they're blacklisted, so they can't come again the following year. So H-2A workers are very vulnerable, which makes them very attractive to growers. Under the law, the company can't hire H-2A workers if there are local people who want to work. This is like the Bracero program. In fact, it's almost identical. So to get around this, after the season of the first strike was over, Sakuma Farms sent letters to all of its longtime workers saying that they were fired. Then it turned around and told the government that it needed to bring in almost 500 H-2A workers because it didn't have any local workers anymore. Those strikers had developed a relationship with the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales. It means the Binational Front of Indigenous Organizations, which is an organization of indigenous people with chapters in Oaxaca and Baja California and here in California. Almost all the workers were from Oaxaca at Sakuma Farms, so they knew who this organization was. And in fact, this organization's the Frente's binational coordinator, Bernardo Ramirez, went to Burlington and spent a week helping the strikers get organized. And here we see Bernardo in the sunglasses on the left, talking with Ramon Torres, who was the leader of the union, on the right there, and you can sort of see the labor camp in the background there. To defeat the firings in Sakuma's H-2A application, the strikers decided to get everyone to sign letters saying that they were ready to go to work. And the Frente Indígena, which had chapters where the workers in California lived, in Madera and Santa Maria, held meetings and they collected the letters from Sakuma workers who lived in California. Those letters then, those letters then were turned into the Department of Labor. And here we see Sarai Martinez, who today is the leader of the Frente Indígena in Fresno, with one of the strikers on the left. If you're a labor activist in the Bay Area here, you probably know who is at the very left there. That's Mike Casey, who's the president of the San Francisco Labor Council and was at the time the president of Local 2, the hotel union in San Francisco. And on the right there is Izzy Alvaran, who is a activist priest here in the Bay Area here, a Filipino guy. So at any rate, those letters were turned into the Department of Labor, which is what we see here. And even though those regulations about not being able to hire H-2A workers or recruit them if there are local workers available, those regulations really aren't enforced most of the time, in fact, almost all of the time. But there was so much publicity by this time about this strike that the government couldn't ignore it. So when the company realized that their application might get turned down, they withdrew it. But they still needed workers because the harvest was on them by that time. So Sakuma had to rehire the strikers, and that was the key battle. If they had lost that one, the strikers would have lost their jobs, the union would have been destroyed, and they would never have been able to get a contract. The strikers got students and workers to help them by boycotting the company's main customer, who was Driscoll's Berries, which is the world's largest berry company. It worked, just like it worked in the 60s with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in the Big Grape Boycott. Cesar said that you only have to cut a company's sales by 5% to make them talk with you, and the Driscoll boycott did that. That new union got help from the ILWU. ILWU gave the union, this new union, research to know how to put pressure on Driscoll's, and then longshoremen refused to load the berries onto the ships that dock in Seattle. And the strikers drove from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border, organizing student boycott committees on the coast all the way. At that time, Driscoll's was putting millions into a new marketing plan. And you can see their marketing plan at Safeway or at any supermarket you want to go to, not just here in California, but all over the country. Half of the berries you see there, more than half, come from just one company, this Driscoll's company. That's why you see so much of their produce in the supermarkets with those fancy labels. So that boycott hit them when they were vulnerable. So Driscoll's put pressure on Sakuma, and finally Sakuma Farms agreed to an election so that the workers could show by voting that they supported their union. And this new union had to invent a legal process because there is no farm worker law in Washington the way we have in California. Remember, workers were excluded, farm workers were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s because growers in the Southwest and the South didn't want African American and Mexican farm workers covered by any labor law. So the retired head of the National Labor Relations Board in Washington State, who was sympathetic, he conducted the election even though the workers weren't covered by the law. And the State Labor Council here counted the ballots. And here you see Jeff Johnson, who was the head of the Washington State Labor Council and one of the most forward-looking labor leaders we've had. Why did this union win? They won because for 4 years, those workers had work stoppages, little strikes in the fields to force the wages up. They learned how to use collective action at work. Those workers organized a democratic organization that they controlled themselves, and then they found allies who helped put pressure on Driscoll's. And I went to the meeting where workers talked about what was in that contract that they had negotiated and voted to accept what had been negotiated. And after the meeting, I talked with one of the leaders, a man named Tomás Ramón. And here's how he described what that contract meant to him. So here we see, on the left, we see Filemón Piñero, who is the vice president of the union. On the right, we see Tomás. He said, I think the contract is a beautiful thing. Tomorrow we'll sign it with Sakuma. Things won't be the same as they were before. The company didn't have any way out because people were strongly supporting the union in the strikes and the work stoppages. We stayed very united, and that's why we won. Our supporters in other places, like the students and other unions, they were also important. And now we're a recognized union, and we'll have more rights and the wages will be better. I think people are really happy about it. The wages are the most important thing. With the contract, they'll be paying a little higher than in past years. No grower in this part of Washington is paying higher than $12 an hour, and now ours are going to be higher. My wife and I have worked for Sakuma for 6 years, and now we'll work with a little more dignity. And if we work 10 or 12 hours, we'll have a little more to show for it. We'll work with more respect, and respect is good, isn't it? So the next day, the workers who led this effort, they sat down with the company's manager, Danny Whedon, here, and they signed that contract. So here's the union's president, Ramon Torres, on the right, watching him sign it. Ramon also talked about what that new contract meant and what kind of union it was that these workers wanted. So here's Ramon speaking at a meeting of the workers in the labor camp during the strike. And Ramon says, union leaders should be workers themselves. I love this because it sounds just like the UE when I worked for the UE. Union leaders should be workers themselves. The decision should be made by the workers. No one should make more than a worker at work. We don't want rich people or money in the bank. We don't want rich unions and poor workers. We've always felt that we are invisible people. We're not just farm workers. We are part of the community. We have children. We pay taxes and Medi-Cal even though we can't get the benefits. We know the contract is going to change our lives. Now, if we make a little more, our children will have other possibilities. It's not that we want to take them out of the fields, but we want them to have opportunities that other children have. That union and contract are important also because there are basic decisions now being made about what kind of future farm workers are going to have in Washington State and all over this country. In the last few years, growers have begun bringing in thousands of workers into Washington under the H-2A program. Not just into Washington, a third of all the farm workers in Washington State are now H-2A workers. Last year, growers brought in about 250,000 workers, H-2A workers, into the US. One of those workers brought into Washington was a man named Ernesto Silva, who collapsed and died in a field in Sumas near the Canadian border just 3 years ago. His co-workers stopped work to protest his death and to demand better conditions at the ranch. The new union, Familias Unidas, came out to help them, but then they lost the visa, those workers who had stopped work, their permission to stay in the US, and they had to go back to Mexico. So here's what one of those workers told me, a man named Jonathan Murillo. He said, I could see that Ernesto wasn't feeling well and he asked to leave work. They wouldn't give him permission. He went back to the barracks to rest. The supervisor, Javier, went and got him out and forced him to go back to work. Afterwards, he continued to feel bad. He had to pay somebody to take him to the clinic, and then when he got to the clinic, he was feeling really bad, and then he died. From the way I knew him, he was a young man, a healthy man. From the time we came from Mexico to California, there was never enough to eat, and often the food was bad. Some of the food actually was thrown out, but they took money for it out of our checks anyway. They took out money for medical care, but we never got any. Some of the workers protested in California, which is where they had been working before they went to Washington, and the company sent them back to Mexico. There were many reasons why we were upset. When we got to Sumas, it was the same. There was a lot of pressure on us to work at work, but what really pushed us to act was what happened to Ernesto when he got sick and there was no help for him. We wanted to talk with the company to reach an agreement, but the company wasn't willing to listen to us. So many of us decided we weren't going to work until there was a solution, and the contractor who recruited us said that they would call the migra and the police. So they fired us, and they forced us out into the road in front of the farm. Sarbanon Farms was fined $149,800 by Washington's Department of Labor Industry for not providing required breaks and meal periods, and that amount a judge later cut in half. Rosalinda told a protest rally at the entrance to Sarbanon Farms, "We completely reject the idea that Silva's life was worth $75,000. No amount of money can pay for the life of a farm worker. The state of Washington refused to fine the company over the death of Ernesto Silva and the firing of the workers who went on strike. The number of workers recruited like Ernesto reached 250,000 last year. A third of all farm workers in Washington are now H-2A contract workers, most recruited by the Washington Farm Labor Association, a labor contractor. And last year, at the instigation of this labor contractor, Washington State's Employment Security Department and the U.S. Department of Labor effectively slashed the legal minimum for those H-2A workers by $6 an hour, increasing profits for the growers. Prefab barracks are appearing in orchards miles from the nearest town. Let's see if we can see them here. Well, we'll see them later. Okay. Inside these barracks, H-2A workers sleep in bunk beds 4 to a room and cook in a common kitchen. Some barracks are linked by a chain link fence. Here we go. Are ringed by a chain link fence topped by barbed wire. And since those workers come up from Mexico on company buses, they have no cars. If they want to go into town, they depend on the grower to provide transportation. Familias Unidas helps H-2A workers to organize and at the same time fights against the expansion of the program. Last year, a group of workers at the King Fuji Ranch contacted the union, and Union President Ramon Torres and Edgar Franks, an organizer, went out to talk to them. And Edgar told me it was freezing and they couldn't feel their feet or hands. Some workers had pains in their arms and their hands, but they were afraid to go to the doctor because they might get written up. Here we see them again behind the fence, right? With 3 written warnings, they'd be fired. The company required them to thin 12 to 15 sections a day, which the workers said was impossible. And this labor contractor has a long relationship with another company that recruits these workers in Mexico and now has 10 offices throughout Mexico. Last year, recruited 30,000 workers. And workers who are recruited through this contractor have to sign a form in which they acknowledge that their employer can fire them for inadequate performance, in which case they will have to return to Mexico. And this website warns them that the company shares these records with other companies in order so that they can select whoever they see fit. In other words, it's a blacklist. It's a yellow dog contract with a blacklist. Cases like these convinced Washington state legislators to pass a bill with greater protections for H-2A workers as well as for resident farm workers. Now, however, there's a danger that Congress is going to pass a law on a federal level that expands this kind of program with more H-2A workers and then with enforcement, a lot of enforcement. If this bill passes through Congress, and it's sort of on hold right now because of the election, but believe me, this is going to come back, even if Democrats win the election, because this isn't so different from the kind of bills that Democrats have proposed in Congress as well, either. So the choice here is between that union contract and stability for farm workers in their communities here, or a program that allows workers to be treated as Ernesto and the Sarbanon workers were, and that sees workers as disposable. So this is what Rosalinda says our choice really is. Here's Rosalinda. She says, In the United States, the immigration system is fed by the displacement of farmers who were landowners in Mexico and Central America. Because of the trade agreements that started in 1994 with NAFTA, they couldn't survive and they moved north. And now many of them are sitting in detention centers. A lot of them have been farmers for generations. They know how to grow food with no chemicals, how to conserve water, how to take care of the land. We desperately need to find a way to change our food system here and to use the knowledge of these family farmers who are coming here before they lose it. You cannot look at producing food simply for the profit that it's going to make. And that's where we are right now. When the production of food is based on how much money a corporation can make from what they're growing, farm workers are a liability. We are a cost in their financial statements. So in the capitalist system, we are disposable and easily replaceable. The guest worker program is a good example. You bring people in and you ship them out and you make money off of them. And it's time to end that. We are human beings and we are part of the community. We eat too, like everybody else. Cesar Chavez said it. We can't afford the very food that we grow. A farm worker can't afford the price for fresh organic carrots and they grow them. It's totally off balance. It's unsafe, unsustainable, inhumane, and unhealthy for everybody, for people, for animals, for the earth. Farm workers are the first ones to feel that unhealthy situation. We have to be the first ones to speak out because we are the first ones to die. The average lifespan of a farm worker is 49 years, 2 years up from what it was in the year 2000. So we're up to 49, hooray. So that's it. I want to thank you for listening and looking at these images. And I think I'll stop here. And if people have questions and comments, I guess now's the time for them. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. This was great. I'm going to call on people. If you want to raise your hand in the participants list, at the bottom of the participants list, you can raise your hand or you can just try to wave at me. I'll try to get everybody. I'll try to keep the stack. I don't see any raised hands at the moment. I'm going to start with a question from myself. Okay, David. I'm wondering what the role of the United Farm Workers Union is in California and Washington, with particular with regard to the workers who are struggling to get unionized.
Well, the Farm Workers Union is really the only union for farm workers in the state of California. In Washington state, the UFW still has that contract with Chateau Saint Michel, and Familias Unidas also exists at the same time. So there are really two unions for farm workers in Washington state. And then in other parts of the country, there are other unions for farm workers now. That was sort of one of the things that happened as a result of the upsurge of the 60s and the great strike and its aftermath. So we have the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in Ohio and in North Carolina. We have the a union called CATA in the mushroom sheds in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There are unions for farm workers in Florida, as well as the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is not really a union, but it's an organization out there that in some ways functions like a union. So I'm just sort of trying to sort of show that, paint a picture so that you can sort of see that the United Farm Workers Union, although it is the largest and in some ways the most important and kind of like the birthplace of these other unions, it's not the only one. And when farm workers organize themselves, or they do things like going out on strike and they look for help, the union that they look for help to, it sort of depends a little bit on where they are.
Right.
I had a picture of workers going out of a field on strike in the pictures I was showing you here. That was a photograph of workers who went on strike in McFarland, which is down near Delano, picking blueberries. And they did what farm workers do a lot all over, which is that they kind of, they organize themselves for pretty immediate goals, like In this case, they were resisting a wage cut. And then they go to the union and say, we're out on strike, come help us. And so the union responds. Familias Unidas does this with H-2A workers as well as other workers in Washington state. And the Farm Workers Union does that for workers here. There were workers at a big pistachio sorting facility in Wasco, also down near Delano, about 600 workers at a company called Primex. This happened in June. And those workers began seeing that in the shed there, that people were sort of dropping out of the workforce, and their co-workers, all of a sudden they weren't there, and the company was telling them not to talk about anything, and they would talk with each other in the bathroom, and they realized that basically workers were getting sick from the virus and leaving work, and people got really scared, and the company was not basically giving workers much in the way of protective equipment. And like in most packing sheds, people were working on assembly lines very close to each other, or conveyor belts, conveyor belts rather. And, so people were scared and they stopped work. And they called up the UFW, and the UFW came down and helped them organize this 2-day strike, after which they kind of negotiated with the company over the conditions, improving the conditions, and then went back to work. They didn't get a contract, and I don't think that the workers were really striking for a contract. They had some very immediate things on their mind. I'm sure that the UFW organizers would have kind of wanted to get a contract if that had sort of been in the cards at the time, but it wasn't. And then later, about 2 weeks later, the company fired about half of their workers, including the people who had been leading these strikes. So organizing a union in the fields is like organizing a union in a factory. We know what that's like. It's like a war. And the companies are going to basically do whatever they can to try and stop workers from doing that. So I think that this is the way in which the union organizes workers these days, is it responds to the spontaneous kind of uprisings that occur from time to time. And the other way in which it organizes workers is that, again, I talked about this law, the mandatory arbitration law, and the union has been able to use this to get contracts for, well, there's one company that I've written about and actually gone into the fields and taken pictures of their workers, a big row crop lettuce and broccoli company down in Salinas in the Imperial Valley called Diorigo Brothers. And they have about over 1,000 workers, 1,500 workers at peak season. And they were one of the sort of like traditional enemies of the union, all the way from the 1969 lettuce strike in Salinas, all the way up until maybe 2013, 2014. And the union threatened to invoke this law because there had been an election years and years ago that the union had won at this company, and the company had refused to sign a contract. And the union said, well, we're going to invoke the law if you don't negotiate a contract with us. And the company sort of saw the writing on the wall, and they negotiated the contract and signed the contract. So that's the other way that the union organizes workers these days. There is a lot of controversy, though, about the UFW, and it's not just the UFW, because of its attitude towards H-2A workers. And the union has set up a division in which it is sort of looking to become a recruiter of H-2A workers in Mexico, in which it's saying, well, what we're going to do is we are going to cut out the corruption, and we are going to become the recruiters. And this is something that the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, FLOC, did when it signed a contract with the North Carolina Growers Association, in which FLOC basically signed a contract for H-2A workers. And this is a lot of controversy. If you talk to Rosalinda Guillen and Familias Unidas, they are very, very upset and angry about these contracts and say, you cannot be a labor contractor and a recruiter and be a union at the same time. And I think that that's true. Personally, that's also, my opinion about it. But I'm just sort of trying to lay out for you what the union's attitude is about it. We'll see how that one goes, I guess. I think that the union is obviously a lot smaller than it was in the heyday at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 1980s, when I worked for the union during those years. The union had maybe 40,000 members and had won elections to represent about 160,000 workers. And I think what was even more important was that if you talked in those years to farm workers in California, pretty much in any field, in any place, people knew who the union was, and they kind of thought that the union, in the end, kind of represented their interests. I think that that's not true any longer. There's been a generational change and demographic change among farm workers. And so the union is a lot smaller, both in terms of its influence and its size now. So I hope that.
Thank you. That's a great, thank you for that comprehensive answer. So I think I was supposed to take a pause to let Jean say a few words about us. So I apologize for that mistake. Jean, what I'd like to do is call on the two people who have their hands up right now and then take the pause for you. Is that okay?
That's wonderful.
Okay. So there are two people, Yusuf and then Michael K. Yusuf, go ahead.
Okay, I've been an interpreter at immigration court and also in criminal and state criminal and civil court. Now, in immigration court, the respondent or the defendant, as they call, they does not get the benefit of a public defender. They must find a lawyer. Also, they don't get the benefit of an interpreter with a lawyer. Well, maybe in Spanish, there are plenty of Spanish-speaking lawyers, but in other languages, that becomes a. Whereas in criminal court, we are supposed to facilitate them and the defendants in every way, while in the courtroom or waiting for the case. Also, the interpreter in immigration court only translates what is posed to the respondent and what the respondent answers. They don't get the benefit of a translation of the discussion between the attorneys and the judge and so on and so forth. Whereas in criminal court, interpret everything, where the defendant gets the benefit of having everything translated. So I think they have, in the immigration court, there's quite a bit of the less, basically. So also my question, maybe I could pose. A while ago, it was proposed that we demand as a transitional demand, taking it away from such agencies as the former INS, the Department of Justice, and now Homeland Security, which is worse, back to the Labor Department, which was pre-war.
Yes, you've gone your 2 minutes. I think David can respond to that. If you want to, if you have anything more to add to that, David.
No, I don't.
Just
David.
maybe just two short things. One is on translation. Thanks for the giving us such a good description about the difference between immigration courts and criminal courts. One of the things that the Frente Indígena actually won here in California was the right to translation into indigenous languages in the criminal court system. And as a result of this, we now have certified interpreters who speak Mixteco and other indigenous languages. In fact, we won this in California when people still hadn't won it in Oaxaca in Mexico. So, and I think that was because of the activity of the Frente Indígena. As far as this transitional demand goes, you know, as somebody who has basically fought almost all the battles over immigration reform over the last 25 years, I have to say that I think that while I hate ICE as much as everybody else does, for sure, I don't think that the call for abolishing ICE per se, or changing the location of the immigration apparatus, whether it's enforcement or visas and so forth, from one federal department to the other, is going to help us much. I think the problem is what our laws are and what the US immigration policy is. And we have, and this is what Linda is pointing to in what she says, and we need a little history, I think, to kind of understand this. We had an immigration policy that essentially was both a racist and exclusionary policy, and at the same time, a labor supply policy from the time when we had our first immigration laws around the turn of the century to the civil rights movement in the 60s. And the biggest example of that was what happened during the Cold War, when we had the Bracero program that on the one hand in 54 brought 450,000 workers into the United States. And that same year, the US deported over 1 million people. And we had those racist exclusions depending on country of origin. The civil rights movement changed our immigration policy and changed our law. And first of all, we ended the Bracero program by abolishing Public Law 78 in 1964. That was people like Bert Corona and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta who did that. And then in 65, we got the Immigration and Nationality Act, which set up the family preference system. And the thinking of the civil rights activists of that era was that we needed an immigration policy that was based on the unification of families and the unification of communities, a pro-community policy that specifically rejected the idea that the purpose of immigration was to function as a labor supply system for employers. And so that was sort of the high point. And since then, we have been moving backwards. You know, the Immigration Reform and Control Act in '86, even though we think of that as being the amnesty law, which it was, the real thing that that law did was, on the one hand, it reestablished the H system visas, which are the guest worker visas, and it vastly increased enforcement by making it illegal for employers to hire people without papers, which really meant that it was against the law to work if you were undocumented, and set up the mechanism of border enforcement, which at the time, if we compare what we have now with what we had then, back then it looks like practically nothing, because there really was no border wall. Not only no wall, there wasn't even a fence, there wasn't even barbed wire in most sections of the border. People would just kind of go back and forth across. I'm not saying that there was no enforcement, but very, very little. And now, and as far as detention centers go, you know, the whole system of the private detention centers and in detention centers for immigrants is a product of the last 20 years. You know, this is not something that is historically somehow inevitable in US history. This is part of what happens depending on which way our immigration policy goes. And sometimes, you know, people have asked me, or I've thought myself, okay, if we had socialism in the United States, what would a good immigration policy be? And I think it's a very complicated question. We can talk about that one too, if you want a little bit. And I'm not going to, other than to say, you know, this is also about us in Mexico. You know, what is our relationship with Mexico? What is our relationship with Central America? And, you know, that's another, you know, long discussion. But the reason why I'm saying this is to say that I think that it is dangerous also to say that we cannot fight for a pro-people, pro-worker immigration system under capitalism. We can, and we can get it. We can get big parts of it because we did it. The civil rights movement did this. And we have forgotten that, or we have had this is another place in which our collective memory has been sort of wiped out by the media and the people who propagate our history for us. So I think that we need to think about what do we actually want here. And if we do that, I think we'll sort of see that, okay, maybe there is a function for the government here in relation to immigration, but what should its function be? And whether ICE exists in the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Labor, actually, I hope that it doesn't exist in the Department of Labor, because really that turns the Department of Labor into something we don't want it to be, which is an immigration enforcement apparatus. So anyway, that's just a little bit of thinking on that one.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Michael, and then we're going to turn it over to Jean for a few minutes.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you, David, for your most recent comment. You said we did it. And I want to take off on that a little bit. But I really appreciated your beautiful photographs and your talk. It sounded like you were starting out with the same talk that you gave to the global justice folks last week, but you went much deeper and much farther in your talk today, and I learned a lot, so I appreciate you. I want to take off from what Kim wrote in the chat, Kim White. He wrote about the labor councils that have different approaches, and some are much more conservative than others. And I wanted you to talk about that, because I grew up with two slogans in my head. One was "Workers of the World Unite," and one was "The workers united will never be defeated." And we have learned about the workers that you have been engaged with and working with for so many decades that have horrible working conditions and horrible living conditions and are fighting desperately. And yet there are many other workers who are not fighting anymore because they're out of work. All the restaurant workers and all the hotel workers who have strong unions, some of them, but they're out of work completely. And I'm thinking of the workers that I come in contact with Democratic Socialists of America, who are largely white, they're largely intellectuals, they're like the graduate student union at UC Berkeley. So there's a tremendous difference between all of these types of workers in our country. And I'm wondering whether you can comment on how we can do it. In other words, unite all of these people from all over their working conditions. That's my question. Thanks, David.
Well, that's a big question, I guess. But, I just, just a couple of thoughts. One is just riffing off of your last thing about DSA and the grad student union and so forth. I don't know if any of you remember Saul Wachter, Saul and Billy down in San Jose. Saul spent his life in the GM plant in Fremont. And Saul was recruited as a student, undoubtedly by the Communist Party, I'm sure, to go to work there, and then was an auto worker the rest of his life. And so when I hear, and I sort of keep listening from a distance, to this debate in DSA about, how to reform the labor movement. And one of the parts of that discussion is this discussion about what they call these days, they call it salting, but it's basically the same idea that people who come from middle-class backgrounds or college students are going to go to work. And that was a big part of also what the left did. I mean, there have been waves of it, right? It happened in the 30s. It happened in Saul's generation. It certainly happened in the 70s. A lot of people went to work in industry. And I think that if we look at, actually, if we look at, some of the leaders of our labor movement today, and we look at some people who are elected political leaders, some of them come out of that history. So, obviously some people don't. Some people abandon it. Some people go for the money. Some people just live their lives differently. But I think that there is, to me, I think I take it as a very good sign, basically, that there are people in DSA who want to go to work and who think that this is a good way to start changing how our labor movement works and how workers work. I think that that's important. I haven't been a union organizer. I mean, I'm a elected officer of probably the smallest unit of the smallest union we have in the Bay Area here, which is the freelance unit of the Pacific Media Workers Guild. But, it's been a long time since I've been a delegate to Labor Council. And so, what I see of Labor Councils, again, I see kind of at a distance. When I was sort of looking at what happened with Familias Unidas, who I was very close to and still am for a lot of years, they had a great deal of support from the King County Labor Council in Seattle and from the Washington State Labor Council when Jeff Johnson was the head of it. In fact, I think that they probably could not have won without that support. So that's great. On the other hand, the Washington State Labor Council, they had an election there and the building trades basically took it over, and now it's a more conservative organization than it used to be. I mean, this is kind of what happens in our labor movement. It's not just a single progression either up or down. It sort of depends on who the active unions are and how, kind of who's out there. There are certain battles that we keep fighting over and over and over again. Elections and what to do about elections, and do we want labor parties, or do we want, are we going to basically put everything into defeating Trump? That's not an argument that's any different from the way it has been. And I hesitate to say that this is an argument between the left and the right. I think this is a basic argument about labor strategy and tactics. And, the person who taught me about it wasn't even a labor activist at the time, Carl Blois, who said, you have to have flexibility in tactics, and you have to have a strategy, and you have to kind of be able to move. And I think that that's what I take into this period of time right now, where I, think, the need of the moment, the urgent need of the moment is to defeat this administration and defeat Trump. But we are still going to be debating independent labor political action the day after that election, regardless of how it goes. Right. So, there you go.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Eugene, and then when we come back, I'm going to call on Judy Ann and maybe go back to the chat to see if there are some leftover questions in there, and then take other people who raise their hands. Gene.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. That was fascinating. I knew, I'm sure you knew when you came to the Marxist library that we weren't going to let you off easy. We're going to ask some penetrating questions about this because, labor has always been at the center of any Marxist theory for hundreds of years. So we need to bear that in mind. And this is reflected in some of our upcoming programs. You did mention DSA. Next week, October 4th, we have our comrade Gerald Smith, who is currently working very closely with DSA, and he's going to talk about, or he's going to lead a discussion on the crisis in education, billionaires' messes and community solutions. And he's been working with the Teachers Union, OEA, and others in putting forth candidates for the upcoming elections in Oakland for the Board of Education. So we know that we need, to be effective, we need to have political power. So Gerald will lead our discussion on that. Following that, October 11th, our comrade Larry Shoup is going to be talking about a comparison between Cuba and the United States in dealing with COVID-19. And I think while he's here, we can certainly question him about socialist solutions to the labor issues in terms of socialist Cuba and capitalist United States. Going on down, October 18th, Raj Sahai will talk on Marx on ecology. October 25th is open. November 1st, our friend Wadia Halabi from Boston, we'll talk about the fall of the Soviet Union and new insights on that. November 8th, that's going to be our first session after the election, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Title is What Now? And I'm hoping we can get Gloria La Riva, the candidate for Peace and Freedom Party, Party for Socialism and Liberation, to come here. Going on November 15th, Rick Sterling, our comrade, will be talking about Syria, and then Stanfield Smith on the 22nd on how the US dominates the world economy. So we're going to keep talking about these various issues and looking not only about labor, the whole question that is so important for us as Marxists to look at the total picture. And then all of this doesn't come cheap. I've been banned from making the financial pitch since I'm a very soft sell person. But let me give it over to Richard Fallenbaum to take charge of that session. Richard.
Well, thank you, Gene, and thank you, David, for your wonderful presentation. And I was thinking during his presentation how rare it is to find a site or a venue for this kind of presentation. There are plenty of ways you can learn about Marxism on the global level, and there are plenty of ways that you can find out about specific issues from a progressive viewpoint or a liberal viewpoint. But the possibility of drilling down from the Marxist theory and looking at specific issues is very rare. And we're fortunate to have a great example of it in David's presentation today. And the Sunday morning is a rare venue for that, and we're increasingly spreading out into a YouTube and hopefully other venues, so that we're seeing worldwide our programs, not only nationally. But this costs money, and we're going to need to spend more money to get this word out. And so I want to urge people to contribute. I'm not able to put the information on the chat. I wonder if somebody else would volunteer, maybe Jean or Sharon.
If I could find it.
Cut and paste it from the email. But it's very easy to make a contribution through PayPal, or you can send a check or cash even to me, and it'll become part of our treasury, our very modest treasury at this point. But we need to expand, and we need to get the word out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. And just to point out, so it's clear to everyone, the Marxist Library sponsors this, but donating to the Marxist Library is a whole different thing than donating specifically to our institute. So we hope maybe you donate to both, but certainly think of donating directly to our work. And the money goes to support our website, to pay for mass mailing that we do, and some other costs. And when we're in the library, we also pay for the use of the room to the library. So I have two hands up now, and I'm going to call on both of them. And then
Sharon, I just put that on our
thank you.
In the chat room.
Thank you. Okay, so next up is Judy Ann. Judy Ann, you have to unmute yourself.
Hi. David, I agree. I am so glad that I didn't go down and make the grits like I was supposed to do for breakfast, and I was just criticized for that. But I'm so glad I took the time to spend here. I wanted to ask you about what you know about what's going on in New Mexico, because I have
Well, could you, I can't quite understand
in New Mexico.
about,
The question is about New Mexico. Do you know anything specifically going on there?
in New Mexico. Not really. The only farm worker, there is a farm worker organization in southern New Mexico next to the border near Las Cruces and El Paso, in the Chiles in Hatch. That was the Farm Workers Union of the Border. Carlos Marentes is the guy that's the longtime organizer of that union. And Carlos is still there and still active. I haven't really heard too much about it. So I did hear, I have a daughter that lives in Las Cruces, and she was saying that the chili harvest in Hatch is really a lot smaller now than it used to be, and the need for workers is a lot less. But I don't really know that much more about it. There is a worker center that Carlos and the union set up that's near the border crossing in El Paso. And I know that they're still open and active, but that's about all I could tell you about it.
The reason I'm asking is because I have a sister who lives not on the Las Cruces side, but on the opposite side, in that little square that's down in the southwest corner. Mm-hmm. So they're about 50 miles from the Mexican border and right along the Arizona.
Well, that's mining country, really, and I've done a lot of stuff with miners, and we just did a presentation for Salt of the Earth Labor College in Tucson about miners on both sides of the border, and it's a very, very colorful and interesting history, and also one that's very active right now because the miners just were forced to end their strike in Arizona, the steel workers, and they're still on strike in Cananea. So a lot of stuff happening there in that section of the border.
This was an interesting situation where there was some company that came in and was all excited about the fact that they were doing organic farming. Huh. And so we decided to leave Little Rodeo, where maybe 78 people live, and go out. And it was a little bit north and then east. So it still was the valley. And they were a fish farm. So they were growing fish, and then they were using that to expand out to do agriculture. And it was a very interesting thing until I heard them say what they did was the workers on the farms, they went to Mexico every day, picked up their workers, brought them in to do the agricultural part of it, and then brought them home every night. And their argument was that there aren't enough people living in that part of New Mexico to actually have regular workers. And I thought to myself, so essentially they're exploiting them. And how do they get away if you have to have a visa to come into the country? How does this organic farming company do that kind of thing? And I never heard of it anywhere else.
It's not that unusual. I mean, in the Imperial Valley, which is, the border goes right between Calexico and Mexicali, and Calexico is just a small little place, but Mexicali is a city with 1 million people in it now. The farm labor workforce in the Imperial Valley, most of it lives in Mexicali. And so there is actually a kind of a visa. It's called a border crossing card. And workers can come and do come across the border. Thousands of people come across the border at Mexicali every morning. to go to work in the fields, depending on what the season is. So I imagine that if they're doing what you're talking about, that those workers who are living on the Mexican side of the border have border crossing cards, and they come across and they work, and then they go back and live. And for a lot of workers, I don't know the situation about the workers you're talking about, but in the Imperial Valley, it's, first of all, workers have their homes in Mexicali. So, I mean, people want to live where they have their homes, but it's also cheaper. The cost of living is cheaper to some degree, although that's not always the case, but mostly it is. And so people like that arrangement and want to, in fact, organizers for unions, including Farm Workers Union, who used to live in Mexicali and come across and work in the US. So it's become a lot harder now because the border is a lot stiffer, harder to cross than it used to be, which means it takes a lot more time to stand in line to do the crossing. But it's a fact of life in border communities.
Right, they just took buses every day and picked them up and brought them back. And
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Richard Wright is next, and then Jean Rule.
I wanted to second the or third the appreciation for your presentation. I got up this morning and I was kind of debating whether I was going to tune in because I was kind of tired, and I'm glad I did. I wanted to. The other thing is it seems to have fit into a theme here lately. My friend Nan and I were up in the the Salinas area. We toured the coastal California and then the interior last year, and then I just happened to see East of Eden a couple of nights ago. So anyway, so all this is sort of, anyways, I grew up in Maine, and right behind where I grew up, there was a big apple orchard, and I mean, we never thought about it, but the apple pickers would come in, for the season, and then they'd leave, and this went on. This was like a seasonal occurrence, and we would be out there playing when they sprayed the pesticides over the apple farm, and admire the plane coming down. It was really cool. And as you mentioned, later on, I was recruited. When I went to school, I was recruited by probably the CP for the Great Boycott, which I'm sure dates me. So I guess one of the questions I had, I had two questions actually were in my mind. One is, we hear a lot about the California agricultural organizing. We don't hear so much about. I know these guys were coming up and down the coast, the East Coast, and we don't hear very much organizing going on up and down the East Coast. Is there any? And the other question is just to really sort of get off on a whole new tangent is, what do you see for the future of labor unions in general? I mean, I'm of the opinion that eventually they're going to end up merging, but of the agricultural workers, farm worker organizing in particular, do you see a merger in the making, and what along what lines would that fall? Thank you.
You mean a merger between U.S. and Mexico, or a merger here in the U.S. among organizations?
No, amongst the organizations, amongst the. I mean, we're seeing mergers taking place in the American labor unions in general.
I see. Okay.
And I'm kind of wondering if you have any thoughts about the future of that trend, and also you mentioned the Farm and Labor Organizing Committee. and the UFW, clearly they're losing members. And I'm wondering if it's going to get to the point where these guys are going to have to merge, and what effects that will have on the movement in general.
Well, as far as unions on the East Coast, there are several. There's a farm worker association in Florida that is more or less a union. There's the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, which that's sort of a long discussion. It's not a union, but it also sort of functions as a sort of pressure group for farm workers to a certain degree. And it also has a kind of a subsidiary now in New England that is beginning to organize among dairy workers. There is the Committee to Support Agricultural Workers, CATA, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New York State just passed a farm law, moves in that same direction of giving farm workers a mechanism for gaining union recognition. And there is a farm worker alliance in New York State that is based primarily among dairy workers in upstate New York that's pretty active. And then there used to be a farm worker union in the Connecticut Valley that was tied to the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. I haven't heard anything about it for a long time, so I don't know if that still exists. I don't think so. In North Carolina, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee has a big contract with the North Carolina Growers Association to represent H-2A workers, which is the subject of a lot of controversy in the labor movement about whether this is a good idea or not. But the union does have it and has representation rights for about 6,000 workers. And a campaign to organize the people who work for tobacco farms in North Carolina, if that were ever to succeed, that would mean that the union would win the representation rights for about 70,000 workers, which would be a huge number of people. That's been going on for quite a while though now, so I don't really know exactly what its status is. And then on the other side of the border, on the Canadian side, Justicia for Migrant Workers is a very active organization, a little bit to the west in Ontario, among the workers who are brought to Canada every year as part of the SAWS, Special Agricultural Worker System. On those sort of they're H-2A-like visas for Canadian workers, but they have had a long history of activity in support of those workers as well. So there's actually a lot on the East Coast. It's a lot in terms of the multiplicity of organizations. None of them are very big, but they're certainly out there. Whether they're going to merge, I don't think so. Not in the near future. They're not very close to each other. The situation in each area is pretty different. There's no movement that's calling for that. And I think that the problems of those unions wouldn't really be solved in any immediate way by merger at this point. Really they have to organize. That's a big problem for any of them. It's like, take New York State as an example. The dairy workers there are a lot of dairy workers in New York State. Organizing them is a big problem because they tend to work in small groups. Each farm, they're not enormous farms. Dairy farms here in California are enormous and huge. In New York State, they're smaller. So how you would go about organizing workers who might work in groups of anywhere from 5 to 20, farm by farm by farm, even if you have this law, they haven't quite figured that one out. But, I think that there's some people who really want to do it. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, a lot more organizing activity in New York State in the next, couple of years. Well, I guess that's about as much as I can really say intelligently about the merger thing. I don't think that's, plus, to be quite honest, the relationships between there are not very good. They don't like each other, most of them. So I don't think merger's really on the horizon in any immediate way.
Okay, The next person up is Eugene Rule, but he just walked away from his, oh, there you are, Gene. You're on next.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I wanted to step out of my role as a member of the program committee and give some personal observations because, I'm a retired union member and I still have my union dues deducted from my retirement check because without the union, I wouldn't be getting a retirement check. So we need to bear that in mind. And, I think it's very important. And I just went away for a while to get out this little picture of FDR that our union rep gave me when he retired. He said, from FDR, if I were a worker, the first thing I would do would be to join a union. And that's always been kind of my motto. I don't consider the unions to be voluntary organizations. But I used to teach at Cal State Long Beach for many years, and I remember the most radical, politically conscious student group was La Raza. And one of the things they did that I stuck with me at their demonstrations, they would say, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." And we have to bear that in mind. This whole area used to be part of Mexico before Anglos invaded and took it over, and that's the heart of many of our problems. And I think we need to bear in mind that also that I was a candidate for the Peace and Freedom Party in Congress and State Assembly 5 times total. But our Peace and Freedom Party platform, which is the only socialist platform on the ballot in California, part of our demands are not only abolish ICE, but also open the borders. And people say, "Oh, can't do that," and so forth. Be all these. I don't see any problem. There wouldn't be more problems if we just opened the borders completely, abolished ICE and the Border Patrol and all those people. And there would be some changes made and so forth, but there wouldn't be more problems that we're seeing right now. So as a member of the Peace and Freedom, well, I'm not there's a little gap between me and the Peace and Freedom Party right now, but just say the platform I totally support, and maybe David want to comment on that, the socialist platform of Peace and Freedom in terms of the issues that we're confronting here. Again,
Thank you, Gene. David, did you want to respond to that?
Well, somebody here also asked the same sort of question too, that is in the chat here. I was looking at. Oh, by the way, on the Gulf States one in the chat, Yusuf's question, I just wanted to say, I have a friend, an Italian friend, Vittorio Longhi, who wrote a book about the situation of workers in the Gulf States, and not only their situation, but their struggles against the slave conditions that they're in. And so if you're interested in it, this is the book, and it's called The Immigrant War, and his name is Vittorio Longhi. And what you said in your comment on the chat about their situation is absolutely true. Okay. So this is a socialist program on immigration, and what would our policy be if the communists took power in the U.S. and built socialism? Okay. So I'm going to first of all make a distinction between answering this question and then talking about open borders as a demand for the immigrant rights movement right now. So I'm going to answer the second question first, or not answer it, but just some thoughts. Okay, so if we had a socialist world, what would it mean? I mean, a socialism in the United States, I think, would mean, if not a socialist world, it would mean a world in which the forces of capitalism would be substantially weaker than they are now. So we would have the chance to do things that we cannot do in a world right now. Obviously, a lot of migration in the world today, and we live in a world in which perhaps, well, according to the UN, as many as 300 billion people or 300 million people are living outside of the countries where they were born. If you want to include internal migration, like in China, the number of internal migrants in China is probably close to 1 billion just right there. So a lot of the migration that is going on in the world today is involuntary. It is a movement of people who are moving basically in order to survive. And that is a product of imperialism. It's a product of capitalism, of the way in which the industrial imperial states of the world have been able to intervene in the rest of the world to create conditions for profit, for making money, which in turn displace people. And the displace, and I think it's important for us to see this not just as a matter of bad corporations doing bad things or bad governments doing bad things or somehow having incorrect policies. This is the way the system functions. You know, you could look at migration as being the labor supply system of the imperial era. That imperialism produces displacement. I mean, capitalism produces displacement from the very beginning. And Marx wrote about, you know, the first stages of capitalism in which this took place, right? The Enclosure Acts, where did the working class of Britain come from, and so forth and so on. So now we live in a world in which this has become very systematized at an enormous scale. So we have migration that is produced by trade agreements like NAFTA. We have migration, the people who die in the Mediterranean, crossing the Mediterranean, fleeing wars in the Middle East. Where did those wars come from? What is the imperial root of the wars that in the most recent period have resulted in enormous deaths and an enormous displacement of people? All I'm saying here is that we kind of make these distinctions, which I think are handy for the powers that be, but ones that we need to unpack, between, for instance, political refugees and what are called economic migrants. Because they are both people who are in movement as a result of the imperial nature of the world in which we are living. Whether it's the production of wars fought for what? You know, the people who came out of Central America, out of El Salvador, and out of Guatemala in the late 1970s and early 1980s were fleeing civil wars fought for what and by who. So to say that they were political refugees or that the people fleeing the war and the revolution in Nicaragua, as our government said, the people fleeing the revolution in Nicaragua were somehow political refugees and therefore entitled to special treatment, whereas the people who were fleeing El Salvador's civil war were not, were economic migrants and therefore not entitled to anything other than TPS. These are distinctions that are made by our government for political reasons. But the reality is that the force that is pushing people into motion and displacing people is the way in which this global system functions. But it is also a system which needs labor. And so the fact that these enormous waves of people then become the workforce in imperial countries is not a byproduct of the system. It is as much a way that the system functions as the displacement to begin with. You know, if we look at the situation of the immigrant workforce in countries like the United States or Japan or the UK, we can see that the economies of these countries have been dependent on this workforce for a high rate of profit for a long time. In fact, there are entire industries in our country that are completely dependent on it and always have been as farm labor. That's why we should look, that's one reason for looking at the history of farm workers and farm labor in this country, is because you can see that this is one of the places where this pattern of development was established from the very beginning. Remember, we never had a peasantry in California. It was always industrial agriculture, which always required labor, which always brought that labor in from somewhere. So anyway, all I'm saying is this is the way capitalism functions today. So if we had a socialist world, what would that mean? First of all, it would mean that we would no longer have an international system that was based on the forcible displacement of people. that countries could develop their economies in a way that served the needs and the interests of the people who lived there. In a way, this is not actually even really socialism quite, because if you go to Oaxaca, you can hear at the meetings of the Frente Indígena, people talking about the right to stay home, el derecho de no migrar, which means that there should be political change in Oaxaca, in Mexico, enough so that a person who grows up in a small town, in a small village in Oaxaca, can have a future, that there's work, that there's education, that there's healthcare, that there's all the basic things a person needs in order to be able to stay there. And they're fighting for this under capitalism. They're not, in fact, Andrés Manuel López Obrador promised people in Mexico that this was part of the program, and he is not a socialist. So whether we have to wait for socialism to fight for these things or not, I don't think so. I think that fighting for them is part of what brings us to socialism, actually. But, all I'm saying is that this is part of what it means, is, the right to have a future in the place where you're born. That being said, though, remember there's another flip side, or I think that there's another flip side to it too, and that is that the movement of people, our ability to move, is hardwired into us as human beings. There's never been a period in human history in which people did not move. And you can say, well, yes, most of this was forcible. True, but not all of it. And in fact, as technology has developed, and as we now have airplanes and airports and the internet and all the rest of it, first of all, it's much, much easier for us to move than it ever has been before. So what are we saying? That this is part of us. This is part of who we are. And as a result of capitalism and imperialism, we now have, for instance, families who are connected from country to country all over the world. So I think that a socialist program for migration also has to recognize the right of people to move. We have the right to live wherever the fuck we want. And a socialist system that starts setting up barriers and says that in the interest of the preservation of socialism, we have to set up the wall, or we have to set up the barrier here, is not a system that is going to live for it's not going to live forever, that's for sure. And we have seen that this is true. And you can argue, as socialists did in the Cold War, that this was a necessity to protect the Soviet Union or to protect the socialist countries, that these barriers to keep people from moving were necessary in a military confrontation with capitalism, which is what essentially the argument was, I think. But was it, what actually happened as a result of it? Did it work? No, it did not. So somehow we have to fight for socialism in a situation in which I think we also have to recognize, capitalism is not going to give up. We're going to have to fight for it. There may be a period in which, again, there is confrontation between capitalism on one side and socialism on the other. And maybe that even has a military component to it. After all, the wars of liberation in Africa were the military component of that struggle, right? But as part of it, do we want to say that therefore people should not move unless we give them permission? I don't know. I don't think that to me it does not recognize the reality of the world that we live in. So this is not to say that, this is the plan for socialism. All I'm saying is that those two components are the two components that I see as being the critical ones. The right to move on one hand, and the right to not move on the other. So open borders now, well, I think it's a sort of a red herring, basically, to be honest, because there are things that we really desperately need to fight for in terms of immigrant rights today. And one of them, for instance, is for an immigration policy in our country under capitalism that does not treat our immigration policy as a labor supply program. That is a critical one. If we can't win on that one, we're going to lose on all the others. So, and we have to fight with the Democrats even more than the Republicans sometimes on that. So that has to be right front and center. No more guest worker programs. No more treating this as being, we're going to close our eyes to what we do to create refugees out of Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, but we're going to make sure that they work in conditions that are very convenient for employers in the United States once they get here. So that's one thing. Second thing is that, and what that really means is that your immigration status is something that is determined not by how people cross the border, but is determined by what happens to people here. Okay, the criminalization of migration doesn't happen because we have a border and border enforcement and that people get picked up at the border and returned. It happens because, for instance, we have employer sanctions that say that it's illegal to work and it's illegal for the employer to employ if you don't have papers. So we have to look at where does criminalization arise from? And how do we deal with it? How do we get rid of the criminalization of migration? So I think the abolition of those laws that criminalize migration and the creation of an immigration status that gives people the same rights that everybody else has. You know, the reality of it is, whether you like it or not, that somebody with a green card has the ability to lead a normal life, whereas somebody with a guest worker visa or somebody who's undocumented does not. What does that say to you? To me, that says we need green cards for everybody. Even if you're not a citizen, even if you haven't made up your mind that you want to live in the United States and apply for citizenship, you still should have the ability to stay here and live a normal life like everybody else. And therefore, how you come to the United States should afford you that possibility. So, you know, I don't know if you want to call that open borders. I don't know really what open borders means. It's like what do you mean? You mean you take down all of the wall, you take down the wall and all of the border crossing apparatus? Well, you know, there are other things that come along with that too. So it's a complicated argument, but to me, I think that the question of, we have to look at immigration from a class point of view, especially for Marxists. You know, we have to see this in class terms. And so, and respond to it as workers. What is it that creates unity between workers in the United States who were born here and workers in the United States who were born somewhere else, and workers in those countries from which the people are coming? You know, those are the key questions for us. So let's not, you know, let's not worry so much about abolishing ICE or abolishing the border. Let's fight for something we can really see very concretely how to fight for it.
Thank you very much. We're going to end on that note. There were a few other questions that had to do with your practice, David. Someone asked about your choice of black and white photos. And you might want to say something about that. And someone else is asking, how do you support yourself and keep going? And how do you publish your work? David has several books, quite a few books right as of now. And one of them that I loved a lot was The Right to Stay Home, which was in which he makes the argument about that if we had a just immigration policy would also help people in Central America and in Mexico and everywhere to our south to stay right there and live their lives in a decent way. We'll give you one final word, David, if you want to talk anything about those questions regarding your practice.
Well, assuming I can support myself, of course. You know, I've been freelancing for 30 years and it's kind of up and down, and I write articles, take pictures. I like it. It's not the most secure way of making a living, but somehow I manage. And plus, I'm married to somebody who had a very stable job for a long, long time, and thank God for that. You know, so we make it by. Now we're living on Social Security because no pensions, of course. That's a problem. You know, if I had stayed as an organizer for all those years and gone up in the hierarchy of unions, I might have had a pension at the end of it, but I don't. So as far as black and white goes, I like black and white because it has an emotional impact to me. And it's sort of simplifies things in a way. You sacrifice something for real sometimes. You know, those tricky women with their huipillas, those are bright red, and you certainly sacrifice the color when you get rid of the color. And sometimes the color is very dramatic and meaningful. But on the whole, I think, to me, the black and white image has an impact that it doesn't otherwise. What was the third practice question? I don't remember.
How do you get published?
Oh,
I
how to
think
get
it was.
published. Well, that's a hard one. You know, as a labor writer and left-wing labor writer, I spend more time trying to find places to publish what I do than I do the work itself, which is always a big frustration. You know, and it sort of changes from year to year. You know, there was a period of time where I published a lot in The Nation, very little now. Currently, there's a website in Los Angeles called Capital in Maine, which they're wonderful people, and they publish my photo essays with this sort of social history text, Mike Davis type social history text that I really like writing and really like putting together, and I think they're wonderful for publishing it. We argue about how much history. They keep telling me, you put too much history in this stuff.
Is there such a thing?
But, you know, since they're a news site, I appreciate the fact that they're willing to publish it at all, because it's so hard. It's so hard to find places. I'm working on another book about the border this time. I have a university in Mexico that's publishing my stuff now. So that's a good one, because finding a publisher in the US to publish a photo book is well nigh impossible. As you know, Totoy has fought about this one for his whole life, and so
a lot of his stuff is self-published for that reason.
That's right.
So what we usually do, it's 12:30. What we usually do is we turn off the recording and we have a more free-flowing discussion for up to half an hour. So Alan, I think you're the one who's doing the recording.
I'm turning it off.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.